The son chose his wife's birthday over his mother's funeral. The father did not argue. He chose the blue coffee thermos, a wooden box, and silence. Then a small question. What day was your mother born? Made the kitchen hold its breath. By the time the porch light came on, would that warmth be enough to warm the whole cold season again? Early morning, the pale March sunlight filtered through the cream-colored curtains, laying a thin patch of light on the kitchen floor, like a tablecloth someone had just folded neatly. In the corner, the old kettle bubbled, making a small but steady sound, like the breathing of someone who has lived alone a long time and is used to repetition. Steam rose and touched the fogged window pane, leaving long runnels. On the table, the blue coffee thermos lay still beside the neatly folded tablecloth. The blue paint on its body had flaked in patches, exposing bright steel in a few spots, chips like the scars of a thing that has stayed beside a person for many years. Arthur bent down, opened a drawer, and rummaged through a cardboard box full of odds and ends, a few loose buttons, a slip of paper with a phone number whose ink had faded, and a clear plastic bag with photographs of Jack from when he was little. He picked them out one by one. Jack, 6 years old, smiling with a missing front tooth, both hands holding up the small fish he had just caught at Reed Lake. Jack, 10, in the back seat of the pickup truck, curled up asleep, hugging the blue coffee thermos like a pillow. Jack, 12, wrapped in a brown scarf Margaret had knitted, standing in the front yard on a foggy morning. Each photo, as it came out of the plastic bag, carried a fine film of dust that fell like powdery snow. Beneath the stack of photos was the birthday card Margaret had bought for Jack, but hadn't had time to give. The paper had yellowed at the edges, her handwriting still round and even. Save this for next year in case Mom forgets. That unfinished line made Arthur, without thinking, let his hands rest longer. He set the card and the photos back together, held them lightly, as if keeping the past from scattering. On the stove, the kettle began to boil harder, the bubbling turning into a small whistle. He poured some of the boiling water into the blue coffee thermos. A faint coffee smell spread out, not strong enough to wake anyone, but enough to keep a kitchen from turning into a complete void. He poured a cup, set it in front of him, sat down, his hands still gripping the stack of photos. The table was clean today, but the chair across from him was empty. There, years ago, Margaret used to sit and have breakfast, sometimes silent, sometimes recounting small neighborhood things. He tried to picture Jack sitting there, holding a cup poured from the blue thermos, looking at him through the steam, saying nothing, only present. Last night, he had received a text from the funeral home confirming the time of Margaret's service. Just a single short line, but it kept him up all night. He thought about calling Jack right away, then hesitated, because he knew that call would have to compete with music, with work, with other priorities that no longer had anything to do with him. His hand tightened slightly on the card. Inside him rose a blend of emptiness and a thin strand of hope. Hope that tomorrow, amid all the distance and silence, Jack would stand beside him, if only for a moment, before his mother's casket. No apologies needed, no flowers, only presence. Outside the window, the oak in front of the house stirred in the wind, the last leaves of the season turning their faces as if looking for a way to fall. The morning light slid across the table, touched the photographs, made their edges glow, blur, then fade, like a memory flashing back and then moving on. Arthur lifted the cup of coffee and took a sip. The bitterness was mild. Warmth flowed into his hand. The whole kitchen was quiet, with only the clock hand moving through its beats. Tomorrow, he would take this blue coffee thermos with him, and if Jack came, he would pour him a cup just as when the boy was small, swallowed by the chair, legs swinging, not yet reaching the floor. On the table, amid the neatly folded tablecloth, the stack of photos and the card lay still, a wordless invitation sent to a son who had gone too far away. Arthur sat still at the table for a long time, the cup of coffee before him gone nearly half cold. The wall clock pulled each beat slowly, every tick like tapping on a decision not yet made. The phone lay by his left hand. The screen was dark, dimly reflecting his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes etched clear. He touched the power button. The screen lit up. The words Jack Mobile appeared in the contacts list. He drew a breath and pressed the call icon. Before the ring could even sound, he cut it off. Tried again, cut it off again. Each time he stopped short, he precomposed in his head the opening lines. Tomorrow is your mother's funeral. You only need to come. You don't have to bring anything. Dad won't ask for anything more. But as soon as a sentence took shape, he felt it as a plea, and he hated that feeling. He stood up and walked to the bedroom. The wardrobe still kept Margaret's arrangement. Winter on the left, summer on the right, and in the middle, the upper compartment with the suits set aside for Jack, the kind she used to buy for him to wear on special occasions. He took it down and gave it a light shake. Black suit jacket, pleated dress pants, still smelling of moisture-proof paper. He suddenly wanted to try it on, not sure why. Perhaps to make sure it still fit so Jack could wear it tomorrow without feeling constricted. But when he put it on, he realized the suit was tight at the shoulders and arms. The seams tugged. The fabric along the shoulders rose in ripples. He turned before the mirror and looked at himself there, an old man grown thinner, yet the cloth still wouldn't lie flat. In that moment, a feeling both painful and hollow passed through him. The suit no longer suited him, just as many other things in this house no longer suited the present. It was being kept for someone who might not come. He took the jacket off, smoothed it, and hung it back on the hook. His fingers paused a beat on the shoulder, as if setting a hope back in its old place. Returning to the dining table, he sat down. Beside him were still the phone and the stack of photos arranged since morning. He looked out the window. The noon light slanted onto the wall, its color pale as a memory washed away. Inside, he told himself, tomorrow he would ask for nothing but his son's presence. Not make him say anything, not make him do anything, only ask that he stand beside him, even if in silence. He closed the phone and pushed it out of reach. His other hand touched the blue coffee thermos, the flaked paint on its edge like an old wound. On the porch, the wind flipped a small oak branch. Its shadow fell across the yard, broken like sentences left unfinished. A Midwestern suburb in early March. A timid kind of chill, no ice, but enough for the porch boards to contract and give a faint crack each time the wind slips through. Out front, the old oak shed its last leaf last night. This morning, the leaf lies still on the step, its edge curled like an unsent letter. The two-story house with gray wood siding, small and neat like a memory box with its lid carefully shut. Crossing the threshold, the clean metallic smell of the sink, a little of the old baking powder in the cupboard, and the smell of coffee gone cold since early morning. The living room keeps exactly the way Margaret arranged it. A dark brown floral armchair angled toward the window, a doubled wool blanket laid over the armrest, a floor lamp with a yellow shade standing guard in the corner. The wood floor gleams, but each of Arthur's steps still teases up a needle-thin creak, rebounding into the emptiness and making the sound feel thicker. The hallway holds frames with cherry wood borders, one wedding photo, one of the whole family under peach blossoms, one of Jack at 8 hugging a ball too big, puffing his shirt at the chest. The glass wears a thin film of dust, hard to see. Only when Arthur runs his hand across does a clean streak appear, like a small river just cleared, and then blur again as new dust settles. He touches little. Everything needs to stand still so the edges of memory won't smudge. The kitchen is where silence settles most clearly. The table is set near the window, where milky gray light slides in on a diagonal. Across the tabletop runs a long scratch from when Margaret set down a heavy ceramic pot last year. Arthur has thought of sanding and waxing it, but each time he comes near, he stops. The scratch is like the grain of bark erase it, and the plank becomes a stranger, no longer home. On the table, the wooden spoon she used to stir batter lies across the trivet, its bowl darkened by oil and time. Arthur leaves it as if someone tomorrow might enter the kitchen, touch it, and stir up the thin sound of spoon on pot. Open the refrigerator, and there's a cold light that can't fill the hunger for conversation. 2 half jars of jam, a bag of broken cookies, 3 apples soft at the stems. The door is crowded with old sticky notes, Margaret's medication schedule, a folded water and electric bill, and a blue ink scrap she once wrote, "Don't forget to pick up Jack Friday afternoon." The handwriting slants slightly, patient, as if the writer were reminding herself each week. Arthur has many times meant to peel it off, then stuck it back in the exact spot. On the kitchen shelf, the oven timer is paused at 17, the final stop in a batch of apple pies that never got turned out of the tray. The fabric-covered recipe notebook lies beside it, a ribbon marking the page, "Crust for Reunion Day." Arthur doesn't open it. He knows that if he did, no flour would fall to the table, and the kitchen would expose a truth. No one bakes for anyone anymore. Arthur's bedroom is orderly to the point of apology. The closet keeps the folds Margaret taught. On the center hook hangs the suit reserved for Jack, the paper sachet faded of scent. Arthur tried it on at noon, the fabric pulled at the shoulders, tiny wrinkles appearing like crow's feet. Then he unhooked it, smoothed it, and hung it back. The gesture was like setting a hope back on its proper peg so it wouldn't fall. In the small study at the end of the hall, the window looks out on the back garden. The earth is sodden. Terracotta pots lie tilted, like a retired army. A shovel leans against the wall, the wooden handle polished by the hands that held it every weekend. On the desk, the old radio is mute. Once Arthur turned it on just to have voices, but the weather readers sounded like passers-by talking beyond the door, no one stepping in. The house is tidy, yes, but people are so absent that things have to make sounds in their place, the clock hand tapping softly. Wind fingering the door crack into a long whistle. The ceiling bulb flickering a weary beat and then settling. Even the blue coffee thermos on the shelf, after being washed and set to dry, gives a small tack each time Arthur sets it down. Like an answer, by late afternoon, the light draws back from the steps. Arthur stands on the porch a while, his hand on the rail. From here, he can see the road leading to the main street where pickups pass. Now and then, leaving a ribbon of cold gasoline smell. The oak shudders in the wind, branch stubs pointing at the sky as if writing an unfinished sentence. He can't read it, but he understands the meaning. Tomorrow, the house must be clean, the chairs set in straight rows, handkerchiefs folded in half. Everything must be as orderly as when someone is due home. He goes into the kitchen, straightens the tablecloth, sets the blue thermos in its exact place at the center of the table, and pulls the chair opposite out a bit, just far enough that someone could sit without asking leave. Then he stands still, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere, very softly, the past is still shifting, a recipe page closing on its own, a cup touching its saucer, sounds as small as specks of dust, yet enough to keep the evening from caving in. When night fully settles, Arthur switches on the kitchen light. The soft yellow lays over the scratch on the tabletop like a thin bandage. He doesn't touch it, he only pulls out the chair and sits, both hands on his knees, and exhales. The house is ready not for a crowd, only for two, one who will surely be present, and one who, if he stops by, will find his place still left open. And Arthur still lives in it as a gatekeeper for a life that has stopped, but not disappeared. The townhouse in the heart of the city shone bright like a box that holds laughter. On the porch, pastel paper pennants fluttered with the wind from the narrow street. Helium balloons with star decals brushed the recessed ceiling lights, their silver ribbons whispering as they skimmed the fixtures. The smell of butter and sugar from the cake set out on the kitchen counter mingled with the new plastic scent of toys and the aroma of marinated meat on a stainless steel tray out back, a sweet, busy blend with no room for quiet. Jack moved between the kitchen and the yard like a technician coordinating the bustle. He set the bubble machine on the threshold, loaded the batteries, tested the button. A stream of round bubbles poured out, caught the light, then burst into tiny specks of water on his sleeve. On the dining table, the goodie bags for the kids were lined up, each sealed with a sticker cut by hand of the letter M, the first letter of Megan, its paper edge still saw-toothed. Megan ran in circles with a paper crown tilted to one side, waving a glowing plastic wand. She stopped at the stove, fogged the oven glass with her breath, drew a heart, then ran off. Jack wiped the blur quickly with his elbow, opened a cabinet, and took out more multicolored plastic cups. He pulled up the music app on the speaker, chose the playlist Birthday Clean, the bass gently vibrating the wooden tabletop. A message from the bakery popped up. Delivery truck stuck in traffic, late 10. Jack typed, "Okay, thanks." Another from the downstairs neighbor. "Could you turn the music down after 9 p.m.?" He dropped in a thumbs up icon, then slid the volume slider down a notch. On the porch, he straightened the chalkboard sign propped by the door. "Happy birthday, Megan." The pink chalk had smudged a little at one corner. He wiped it neat with a wet cloth. The backyard was small, but enough for a gas grill, a folding table, and a few plastic children's chairs. He carried the tray of meat outside, tilted his head to take in the spices smell, then pulled out the spray bottle of water set by the grill. At the base of the wall, a heap of dry leaves had gathered from last week. Jack bent down, swept them aside, and crushed the brittle remnants underfoot until they crumbled. He looked up, checked the strand lights drooping along the eaves, and tightened a loose tie. Inside, a toy ping-pong paddle fell to the floor. Megan bent to pick it up, paused by the corner where the old stroller leaned against the wall. She stuck a sticker on the handle and ran off, leaving a trail of glitter from the hem of her dress. Jack followed, picked up each bit, and dropped it in the trash. He glanced out the kitchen window. The sky was darkening, and the windows of the apartments across the way were lighting up one by one, like squares on a chessboard. Somewhere across the street, a horn sounded, and voices called to each other from balconies, the kind of city noise as familiar as a stomach rumbling at dinner. Friends began to arrive. The doorbell gave a short chime, followed by the slap-slap of little sandals. A boy hugged a gift box, wrapped in dinosaur print. A girl held a bunch of press-to-squeak balloons that let out a shrill chirp. The adults traded quick hugs, laid coats over chairbacks, and asked where to leave their shoes. Jack took a marker and wrote Megan on the newest gift box, his handwriting slanting to the right, broken in places because he had to pause to lift a pot of sauce off the stove. He checked the folded-in-half shopping list on the refrigerator. Number candles, spoons, napkins, lighter, paper straws. Everything had a green check mark. On another corner, a sticky note reading, "Grandpa," had a lifted edge from the breeze. Jack smoothed it flat and left it unmarked. His phone buzzed on the table. A photo notification from the preschool class group chat. He opened it for a second, zoomed in on a picture of Megan laughing, her eyes slanting into two small streaks of flame, then locked the screen again. Out back, he turned the gas knob. The blue flame drew into an even cone. A thin smoke rose, carrying the caramel sweetness of barbecue sauce. A friend laid a hand on his shoulder and offered a beer. Jack shook his head and pointed at the clock. He moved each piece of meat to a hotter spot, tapped the stainless tongs, flipped. The sizzle came just as a cluster of bubbles drifted by, reflecting the fire into tiny stars. Near the fence, a patch of grass was scorched from last week's rushed grilling. Jack unconsciously pressed his toe down, then pushed the grill back half a step. A small detail no one noticed, but he did it anyway. On the folding table, he set aside a paper plate, added an extra slice of cheese, and left it unnamed. His hand hesitated for a second, then he slid the plate to the inner edge, the corner few could reach. At 7 sharp, the string lights came fully on, turning the backyard into a small stage. Megan stood in the center of her circle of friends, the number candle already set, waiting for a spark. Jack watched her step on a bright dot that fell through the leaves, a beam from the apartment above, then went into the kitchen for the lighter. Passing the dining table, he paused at the blank card prepared for the Write a Wish game. He picked up a pen and wrote half a line, "May you grow slowly." When the doorbell rang again, he set the pen down, the word slowly still missing a diacritic. In the din of the party, Jack ran each detail like he was pulling fine strings. He poured orange juice for the kids, reminded a friend to switch off the bubble machine when the wind gusted, rehung the Megan backdrop when an E fell. Everything slid into place neatly, smoothly, cheerfully. No one noticed his phone screen down, quiet. No one asked what he had on tomorrow night. The music corkscrewed through the house, lighting every small corner with laughter. The child's party unfolded exactly as the city expects, colorful with enough photos, easy to share. And amid everything running like a joy-making machine, there was a tiny, nameless, empty spot standing at the edge of the table, waiting for a hand to pull the chair beside it out. Evening touched the kitchen with a thin light, gray as a river's surface at day's end. The kettle had been off for a long time, but the warm metallic smell still lingered. On the table, the blue coffee thermos sat in its exact place at the center of the folded-edged tablecloth, beside the stack of photos and Margaret's card. The wall clock passed the 7 with a dry tick, like someone tapping lightly along a spine. Arthur picked up the phone. The name Jack glowed on the screen like a small, bright window opening in a room with few voices. He drew a breath, looked around the kitchen, the opposite chair still pulled askew as a place for someone arriving late, then pressed call. Before 3 rings could finish, the other end clicked on. Not a voice, but a block of sound blown straight into his ear. Pop music, clinking glasses, children calling to one another, the pop of someone opening a can, and laughter bursting like bubbles. He held the phone a little away, waited for a lull, then put it back to his ear. Through that wash of sound, Jack's voice rose, not loud, but clear as a blade just drawn from its sheath. Mom isn't coming back, but Megan's birthday only comes once a year. In an instant, everything on the table seemed to shift a millimeter. The card slid off the stack of photos, the wooden spoon closer to the edge than usual, the yellow light beating down on the scratch in the tabletop half a shade deeper. Arthur said nothing. He didn't have time. The sentence cut clean, like a cord yanking down a suspension bridge inside his chest. On the line, the music swelled again. Someone called cheers. A child blew a plastic noisemaker. Wrapping paper rustled. The call was still open, but there was no space left for a single dad to wedge in. Arthur held the phone for 2 more breaths. Each was short. A small heat rose from his wrist to his ear and then withdrew, leaving behind a clean cold like a freshly scoured sink. He moved the phone away, looked at the screen, the name still lit, and tapped the red button. The sound was severed. Quiet fell into the kitchen like fine dust. He set the phone down gently, but it still touched the corner of the photos with a soft click, just loud enough to hear. His other hand touched the blue coffee thermos. The cold metal instantly drew the warmth from his fingertips. He pulled his own chair a little closer to the table, as if someone were neatening the boundary of himself. On the wall, the clock remained unperturbed. Outside the window, wind slipped through the oak, the porch step shivering out a tiny crackling sound. In the kitchen, everything returned to its place, orderly to the point of cruelty. He looked at Margaret's card, the unfinished line, "Save this for next year in case Mom forgets." Suddenly seemed as if someone had lightly struck through it with a pencil. No words came out, no curse, no groan, only a very slow motion. His hand left the coffee thermos, came to rest on the edge of the folded tablecloth, and smoothed flat a crease that had never been wrinkled. Somewhere in the house, a draft shut a door on its own, leaving a thin thunk. Arthur looked at the chair opposite, still half a hand's width askew, like a seat just warm enough. He kept his gaze there longer than usual, as if by looking long enough, someone might step in and fill that empty space. But the kitchen gained no new figure, only the smell of coffee thinning, dissolving into the smell of warm water. He reached for the phone again, flipped it face down, and left it like a stone set to hold down a page that's flipped open. Then he sat still, listening to his heart slide through a tight bend. A sense of unfairness, sharp and cold, passed through his chest like a draft, leaving behind a long strip of emptiness. Across the city, the party went on. Here, a man sat straight-backed at a scratched wooden table, hands on his knees, eyes unblinking. Night had not fully arrived, but the light in the room had changed, not warmer, not colder, just clearer, as after a single cut. The screen went dark, and the kitchen fell into a silence thick as sugar syrup left overnight. Arthur set the phone on the table, so gently there was almost no sound. His palm still held the chill of the glass, a clean kind of cold that made one alert rather than shiver. He stood up. The chair slid lightly over the wooden floor, drawing a thin line of sound like a taut thread being pulled. On the table, the blue coffee thermos still sat centered on the square folded tablecloth. The steam had gone out entirely. Beside it, the stack of photos was slightly askew. Margaret's card slipped a millimeter. He didn't straighten them. He only reached out to switch off the kitchen light, letting the room retreat into the gray of dusk. The porch door opened without a sound. Early March air struck his face with the smell of damp earth and a hint of wood smoke from the neighbors. The wooden steps had grown cold, the grain contracted to reveal fine cracks. He sat on the top step, back straight, the habit of someone who spent many years learning not to fall backward. The sky was a listless gray, the cloud ceiling low like a lid clamped tight over the town. The oak in front of the porch stood rigid, its spindly branches like the skeleton of a large bird. At the curb, last night's final fallen leaf still lay there, curled in on itself like a small beached fish. A draft slipped through, turned the leaf a degree, then moved on. The city's sounds reached here by a roundabout path, the far-off thrum of engines, a clipped bark of a dog, the metal wind chime across the street striking now and then a solitary note. Somewhere else, the music and laughter were still going on, he supposed. But on these steps, there was only his own breathing and the porch boards expanding from the cold. His right hand rested on his knee, his left gripped the rail. Sometimes a light heat slid from wrist to ear and then thinned away, like a flame testing itself in an oven with the gas turned off. He swallowed, not to suppress anger, but to keep it from turning into words. Words once spoken stand in a house like a stain that's hard to scrub away. The porch bulb flickered very slightly, like a tired blink. He glanced at it, then left it alone. In this season, Margaret would change the bulb before the dark settled in. She would stand exactly where he was sitting, twist the bulb clockwise, her hands smelling of paint and pastry dough. He couldn't remember which smell came first. Memory sometimes runs out of order. Inside, the phone lay face down. Still, no message. He knew how to wedge an apology into the crack of silence call again and again, send lines that make the young feel guilty. But tonight, he didn't. He set something else on the step beside him. Emptiness. Emptiness has a voice of its own. It travels over the roof, skims the door frame, lies in the place where the opposite chair is pulled askew. It says what reproach usually ruins, that no one in this house wants to turn kinship into a kind of obligation to be signed for, that a person may be absent from the bright party and still have a place at a farewell that needs less light and more warmth. He slipped a hand into his coat pocket and touched an old parking stub, a coin, and a scrap of paper with the funeral home's address. The paper was folded in two, the corner worn. He smoothed it, then put it back. The step's coolness seeped through his trouser fabric and numbed his knees a little. He sat a while longer, counted 3 beats of wind, 4 beats of his heart, 5 metallic beats of the wind chime. As the darkness thickened, he stood, unhurried. He went into the house, switched on the kitchen light, and let the soft yellow lie over the scratch in the tabletop like a thin bandage. He picked up the phone, squared the stack of photos, set the card back in the middle, then poured a little boiling water into the blue thermos, a gesture of warmth for things that don't know to ask. The hall closet was ajar. He opened it, took out the suit prepared for Jack, smoothed the shoulder, and plucked an invisible thread from the lapel. He hung it back. No fresh sachet, no slip of paper tucked into the pocket. The suit had to be ready like a courteous invitation, with no notes. He returned to the table and pulled the opposite chair another half a handspan out of line. The seat was like a reminder of a debt that charges no interest. Then he turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow of the porch lamp. Before closing the door, he looked over his shoulder, the tidy kitchen, a thin streak of light sliding across the table, the blue thermos in the place it has always been. The night on the porch sank a step deeper. He sat down again, hands interlaced, his back lightly against the post. Finding no words that could mend anything, he let the silence do its work, gather the shards, draw a border around the loss, and let someone, if they wished, see themselves in the darkest part of the picture. Somewhere in town, a countdown of 3, 2, 1 might be rising before a candle. Here, there was only a man listening to the gray sky, and in a space taut as a drumhead, he decided he would ask for nothing more than presence if it came. If not, the house still had room for sorrow to spend the night without breaking anything else. The sliding door closed behind him, and the music from the yard was blocked into a dull, low band. Jack sat on the edge of the chair by the kitchen, the phone resting neatly in his palm. The screen still showed the just-ended call, the name Dad standing alone like a dark square in the city's grid of lights. His thumb slid into messages. A line appeared and then vanished like an impatient fish. "I'm sorry, tomorrow." "Delete." "Type again." "I will." "Delete again." He tried to call. The ring sounded once. He hung up. Inside him, something was jittery, like a bundle of wires bound too tight. From the living room, his wife's and daughter's laughter popped like confetti and spread down the hall. Megan shot past the kitchen, her paper crown tilted all the way to one ear, a glowing magic wand in her hand, leaving a thin trail of glitter on the floor. She leaned in, asked something tiny, then ran off to the knot of kids arguing whether the number candle should be set slanting left or right. Jack nodded, not catching the words, only managing a wave. The butter sugar smell was sweet right up to his nose. On the refrigerator, the note that read "Grandpa, see," lifted at the edge in the draft from the range hood. He stepped over, smoothed it flat, then pulled it down entirely, folded it in half, and slipped it into the drawer with the matches. A small action, but like hiding a small knife somewhere out of easy reach. The phone buzzed softly with a notification from the preschool group chat. He flicked past, didn't open it. On the lock screen, an old photo surfaced, an automatic memories feature of him at 10 years old, standing at a lake shore, holding up a small fish, his mother's shadow behind him shading the sun, half her face cut from the frame. He shut it off at once, like turning off a leaking tap. Out back, someone called, "Jack, can we turn the music up a bit?" He answered, "Sure," and nudged the volume higher just as the doorbell rang. A couple arrived late, bringing a new bunch of balloons, the house filled with another layer of fresh noise. He smiled, took coats, held the door, said the lines, "Make yourselves at home. Cake's almost here. Candles are ready." His mouth worked smoothly, his hands worked smoothly. Only the nape of his neck burned as if a palm had been pressed there. He went back to the kitchen, opened the lower cabinet, took out the lighter, and without thinking, glanced through the glass door toward the yard. The string lights cast a diagonal band across the wall. By the fence, last week's scorched patch of grass looked like a bruise. Jack picked up the water spray bottle set by the grill, gave it a test squeeze, heard a small sizzle. He did the safe things, the small things, the things that needed hands, not a heart. The phone was in his hand again. He opened the call log. Dad sat at the top. All it would take was a tap. All it would take was letting it ring all the way. All it would take was saying, "I'll be there." He tried to picture saying it and felt his throat clamp as if he'd drunk water too cold. In his head, images drifted across. The old kitchen counter, the blue coffee thermos, the scratch from the heavy ceramic pot, the suit jacket he'd tried on and found tight, the porch door looking out to the oak. Those things assembled into a separate room with no soundtrack, no balloons, no cheers. "Jack, where are the candles?" his wife called from the doorway, her voice lightly urgent, happy. He realized he was standing motionless in the kitchen, the phone raised to his chest like someone about to take a picture but forgetting to press the button. He pocketed the phone, grabbed the number candles, and brought them out. The kids gathered around the table, their round eyes mirroring the flames. Megan looked to him, waiting. He bent down and whispered, "Make a wish." She closed her eyes, lips pressed, brow furrowed as if trying to tie an invisible thread. Jack lit the wick. The candle began to burn, a small yellow flame swaying atop the number of years. People clapped and chanted the count. He counted with them, smiling, his hand at the small of her back. When the candle went out, the cheer broke like a wave. Suddenly, from somewhere in the house, the porch light flickered once. Jack glanced through the window. The light outside went dark and came back, a tired blink. His wrist prickled. Need to change the bulb, he thought. Mom used to change it this time of year. The thought came quickly and went just as fast. Like a bird skimming over the roof, they served the cake. On the table, the plate he'd set aside at the inner edge still sat there, cold and white, a slice of cheese beginning to dry at the rim. He slid the plate another half-handspan inward. At his ear, his wife's laughter. In front of him, Megan's frosting-smeared mouth. In his pocket, the phone heavy as a small stone. He slipped over to the sink, turned on the water, rinsed the cake knife, his finger skimming the steel edge, icy to the touch. He pulled out the phone and reopened the draft. "I'll be there. The blinking dash. He stopped. The thought of an early drive, of arranging someone to watch the house, of his daughter's eyes that morning, of the empty chair tomorrow, all of it jostled through a narrow doorway. Outside, someone turned the music up again. The song was buoyant, the chorus like a carousel that never stops. Jack stared at the screen another second, then locked it. He set it face down on the counter edge, right beside the napkin someone had used to dry their hands. A wet streak seeped along the phone case and darkened. He turned back, picked up the plate for the person who wasn't there, and set it right next to the others. The rest of the evening's tasks still waited. Pour the orange juice, clear the wrapping paper, remind the kids not to run near the grill. He did it all as if time had only one direction, forward, but inside, a fine cord tugged the other way, stubborn, silent, cinching once around his chest. Toward the end of the night, when the noise drained down like water emptying from a tub, Jack was alone at the sink. He opened the window to let the cake smoke out. Outside, the porch light flickered once more. He stared, then flipped the switch off and on. The light held steady. He nodded, as if to himself. Then he reached for the phone and took it in his hand. He didn't place a call. He only set it in his palm and felt the weight of a small object that could change the course of all of tomorrow. In the living room, his daughter had fallen asleep on a chair, crown askew, wand gone dark. His wife tucked a blanket over the child and glanced back at him. Jack smiled. For now, he left the past standing on the threshold, not in yet, not gone either. And between those two banks, he heard his own breathing, even but not deep. That afternoon, the light drew back from the steps like water draining from a bowl. The early March wind was thin and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth from the lawn and a hint of distant wood smoke. Arthur sat on the top step, back straight, hands laced together. The porch light flickered once and held steady, leaving a pale yellow halo on the wood, crazed with hairline cracks. The iron gate at the street clicked faintly. Ruth, the neighbor from across the road, came into the yard, cradling a long loaf of bread wrapped in a checkered cloth. Her sweater was worn at the elbows, her hair clipped back with a matte plastic barrette. She moved slowly, as if afraid to break the silence waiting on the porch. "The bread's still warm," she said, her voice low, just enough to rise above the wind. She didn't hand it to him. She set it on the middle step, exactly between him and the empty space beside him. Heat seeped from the cloth. The smell of yeast and flour met the cold air and rose in a thin wisp. The crust had a small split, revealing a pale yellow crumb speckled with air pockets. She tugged the cloth close around the loaf, holding in the heat like keeping a tiny secret. They sat side by side, half a step apart. The street was quiet. Only the metal wind chimes across the way touched now and then, leaving a solitary note in the air. Arthur looked at his knees. His palm still held the chill of the phone's glass he had just set down. "The day my husband died," Ruth began, eyes on the oak. "The boy didn't make it back in time. He had a site to supervise." She paused a beat, as if letting the words find their place. "I don't blame him, but since then, I've learned to brew my own tea, to light a candle every night." The sentence fell onto the wooden step like a small pebble, no echo, only a stilling of the thin layer of water in whoever was listening. Arthur nodded slightly without looking over. His hand rested on the edge of the cloth, feeling the steady pulse of warmth escaping beneath the fabric. "The porch light at my place," she went on, "flickered all evening the other night. I changed the bulb the next morning." She smiled, the corners of her eyes gathering kind creases. "It was easier to breathe that night." The words "easier to breathe" passed across the porch like the brief shadow of a bird. Arthur glanced up at his own porch light, the yellow shade faintly dusty, the metal ring dulled by the sweat of hands. He thought of the winters when Margaret stood on this very step, tilting her head back to screw in a new bulb, the smell of apple pie dough still on her wrists. Ruth lifted a corner of the cloth and broke off a small piece. She brought it to her lips, not to eat, but to smell, as if confirming the warmth was still there. I still keep his photo by the bed, she said, almost a whisper. I light a small candle every night, not for anyone to see, just to know there's something still burning in my house. The wind shifted, carrying the bread's warmth toward him. His eyes stung a little. At the curb, the oak's last leaf spun once and lay still. From the house across the way, the TV bled through a thin curtain, a newscast half read, a muted game, little needles stitching the afternoon closed. "How's your son these days?" he asked, the question leaving him slowly, as if feeling its way through thick cloth. "Still well," she answered, then, after a beat, "calls less, but he sends photos from the site. I print them and clip them into my baking book." She laughed, unconsciously dusting flour from her fingertips. "Every time I open the book, it's like opening a window." They were quiet. The loaf lay between them, giving off slow heat. Their shadows stretched across the grass, broken at the second step. To his right, where the pulled askew chair had waited since morning for someone who hadn't come, a mute patch of yellow lay still. "I'll leave this here," Ruth said, standing, drawing the cloth tight around the loaf once more. "Break a piece when you like. Don't let it cool alone." She stepped down into the yard, opened the gate, and nodded back, a nod from someone who has said what is right and enough. Arthur remained with the loaf. He didn't break it. He set his hand on the cloth, let the heat seep through his skin, travel up his forearm, into his chest. Somewhere in the house, the blue coffee thermos was cooling. A little boiling water would bring the warmth back. On the porch, the light trembled or his eye moved. He wasn't sure. He carried the loaf into the kitchen and set it beside the blue thermos on the neatly folded tablecloth. Two warm things stood close together, making no sound, but changing the color of the air around them. On the wall, the clock passed the 6 with a tick, clearer than usual, like a fingertip tapping to remind someone in the house to breathe evenly. He sat and looked a long time at the scratch across the table, the mark from the heavy ceramic pot Margaret set down last year. He pictured a small candle placed exactly at the center of the scratch. The flame would darken the ring of wood around it, draw a warm halo enough for 2 cups of coffee to stand side by side without any need for words. The thought was not a decision. Only a thin line of ink newly appeared on the page, not yet dry. Outside, the metal wind chime sounded another note. Ruth had reached her gate across the street. Her silhouette cut the deepening sky like a gray thread. Arthur poured boiling water into the blue thermos himself and heard the small tack of the cap catching on the threads. Heat rose and brushed the loaf, waking the yeast's scent. In the kitchen empty of voices, one warmth was passing into another warmth, and between those two warm things, Margaret's memory no longer stood alone in the cold. In the kitchen, Ruth's loaf lay beside the blue coffee thermos, like 2 small embers still holding heat. Arthur set his hand on the breadcloth again. The warmth soaked through his skin, not searing, just enough to let the hand, gone dry, know its pulse still ran beneath the bluish veins. From the porch, the metal wind chimes shook a thin single note, then went quiet. He watched the spot where Ruth had vanished past the gate, her words easier to breathe, still hovering on the steps like a ribbon of vapor not yet dispersed. Loss turns out, no one can fill it, but warmth, if placed in the right spot, can keep a house from contracting in the cold, and warmth doesn't need noise. It finds its way through very small things, a light bulb screwed tight, a cup of hot water poured full, a piece of bread broken in 2, a wool scarf set just so on the back of a chair. He stood and walked down the hall. On the wall, the wedding photo still hung straight. The glass reflected a thin band of light from the window. He stopped in the bedroom and opened Margaret's vanity drawer. Inside, everything was as when she still arranged it. monogrammed handkerchiefs with an M, a perfume bottle with only a faint bass note left, a box of hairpins, and a hand-stitched cloth-bound notebook. The smell of old powder crossed his nose, so light that if he breathed too hard, it would be gone. He closed his eyes for a beat, then opened them, lifted the notebook, and brushed the dust away with the back of his hand. There was a small scratch on the cover, the same kind of score as on the dining table. He didn't open the notebook. He set it on the table beside the high school team mug Jack used to insist on drinking from. On the high shelf, the low wooden box with the sliding lid still sat empty. He pulled it down and wiped it with a cloth, gray threads of dust gathering into lines along the grain. When his hand reached the lid's edge, his nail snagged on a small chip. He smoothed that edge with his thumb, as if soothing an easily bruised child. In the living room, the afternoon gray had thickened. He switched on the floor lamp with the yellow shade. The light didn't push the dark back, but it made it less sharp. He set the wooden box on the table and stood looking at it for a while, the calm look of something empty. Beside it, the wooden spoon Margaret used for batter still lay across the trivet. He turned the spoon so the darkened end faced inward, the way she used to make the table look tidy. He went back into the kitchen, opened the tap, and poured more boiling water into the blue thermos. The soft tack of the cap catching its threads sounded just as the ceiling bulb flickered once. He glanced up, the old habit to tighten it rising at once, but then he stopped his hand, not to tighten something for someone else. Today his work was to keep a memory warm for the one who would need it, to keep warm not with demands, but with things a hand can touch. In the drawer by the phone there was a stack of sticky notes. He pulled one, tested the pen. The ink ran out in a thin blue line, then deepened. He set the pen down, wrote a few words, paused, struck them out. A new sheet slid free. He wrote another line, shorter, and stopped again. The line that truly needed writing, he felt, had to be sparse enough not to make the receiver step back, but weighty enough to stay put in their palm. He folded the crossed-out sheet in two and set it in the box without closing the lid. Not yet. At the head of the hall, a small window looked out on the back garden. The ground was sodden, the terracotta pots stacked upside down in a row, the shovel handle leaning against the wall. He cracked the window so a stream of cold air could move in, sweep along his back, then fade out in the kitchen. That chill made clearer a decision just set down. From tonight on, everything he did would be to make it easier for Jack to breathe when he came back to stand in the middle of his own loss. Not so Jack would be grateful to him, not so he would be soothed. The aim lay between the two of them, like a candle set at the center of the scratch, small enough not to glare, warm enough that a hand doesn't pull away. He passed the refrigerator. Margaret's note, "Don't forget to pick up Jack Friday afternoon," was curling at the corner. He pressed it flat with a new magnet, a baseball-shaped one Jack had stuck there when he was little. His hand stayed on the door a beat longer than usual, as if warmth could travel through metal to someone a few blocks away. The sky fell quickly. He opened the porch door. The yellow from the shade cast a round pool of light on the wooden steps. The oak spread its black fingers against the sky, still as a statue. He stood under the lamp and wiped the dust from the metal ring. Didn't tighten, didn't fix, just wiped. The gesture of someone clearing a place so the light can stay longer. Back in the kitchen, Ruth's loaf was still warmish. He broke a small piece, dipped it in coarse salt, and chewed slowly. The bread melted, light as air in lungs just opened. He looked at the wooden box, waiting on the living room table. Beside it, the team mug, the cloth-bound notebook, and the empty space for other things to gather tomorrow. In his mind, a short list appeared without words: the camping album, the brown wool scarf, something that holds her scent. Each item a small flame. He pulled the opposite chair at the dining table, another half handspan askew. The space for the latecomer should always be easy to sit into. Then he dimmed the lights, leaving only the kitchen's warm glow. In the just enough quiet, his new thoughts settled into a breath. No one can replace anyone, but people can place into each other's hands things that know how to hold heat. He would do that, not for himself, but for Jack, so that when his son touched them, he would feel some part of Margaret still warm, and therefore the part of himself would not have to grow cold. After the funeral, the sky laid a thin layer of mist over the town like a bedsheet just shaken out. Arthur's wool overcoat still held the smell of rain and the cemetery's earth. Back home, he hung the coat on a chair, took off his gloves, and washed his face with cold water. In the bathroom mirror, his face looked like paper folded many times, flat, but keeping its old creases. The kitchen was unchanged, the blue coffee thermos set in the middle of the table, the tablecloth edges neatly folded, the kitchen light a soft yellow. The long scratch Margaret's ceramic pot had made last year exactly where it belonged, a grain of the house's own. He walked down the hall and opened the living room door. On the low table, the sliding lid wooden box he had set out the day before sat like an empty cradle. He drew the curtain back a little to let the afternoon light reach deeper. Dust drifted like fine threads, floating and falling. He wiped the box's surface with a soft cloth, the grain showing a color like old honey. His finger smoothed along the lid's edge and paused at a steel chip, like a slip of the hand from some other year. He poured a drop of polish onto a rag and rubbed in slow circles. The wood drank the oil, warming under his palm. He began to gather the things of Margaret's that Jack had once cherished, not to stack the past back together, but to place in his son's hands something that still held heat. First came the camping album. On the high shelf between two baking books, the brown leather-bound album lay still, its corners worn. He pulled it down and a fine dust puffed onto his wrist. Inside, a photo of Jack in a baseball cap, holding a fishing rod longer than he was, standing by Reed Lake, one of the family around a fire, its glow laying warm patches across Margaret's face. A dawn shot, steam rising like smoke. Jack grinning wide, a gap where a front tooth should be. On a few pictures, Margaret had stuck small notes. Lake calm, 6:15 a.m. Jack's first time starting the fire. He turned the pages slowly, pressed down the slightly lifted edges, then laid the album in the box, flat so the spine wouldn't strain. The sound of the leather back touching the box bottom was like an exhale. Next was the high school team mug. It sat on the kitchen shelf among white porcelain cups. The blue glazed logo still clear, a small chip on the handle. Jack had insisted on using it every morning during the season. Said he drank for luck. Arthur rinsed it with warm water, dried it, kept the clean clay scent and the faint soap, then tucked a paper napkin inside to keep it from scratching the album. He set the mug in a corner of the box, leaned lightly against the side, the logo turned up as if a tiny stadium light were shining inside the box. Last was the brown wool scarf Margaret had knitted. It lay in the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, folded in thirds, a faint trace of the shampoo she used still in the middle. He pressed it to his cheek for a moment, then spread it on the table. The stitches were even and neat, with here and there a tiny stray stitch, the mark of a knitter hurrying because the weather was about to turn. He folded the scarf again and wrapped it around the album like wrapping a body's warmth, the two ends cradling the ceramic mug so everything in the box would touch by softness, not hardness. Before closing the lid, he looked again. Album, mug, scarf, three ordinary objects quietly turning toward one another as if they could speak. He added a thin envelope with a few extra photos, one of Jack asleep in the back seat, hugging the blue coffee thermos like a pillow, a pressed dry leaf, one Margaret had picked up at the park entrance, and a short piece of black paracord, the end still knotted the way Jack once practiced. He went back to the kitchen and poured boiling water into the blue thermos, the cap's small tack as it caught the threads, heat rising to brush his cheek. He set the thermos beside the box, like placing one warmth next to another, letting one heat find the other so neither would have to stand alone. On the table, the blank note lay waiting. He chose a blue ink pen, the kind Margaret liked because it made round, even letters. His right hand trembled slightly as he set the pen down. The first line came out broken. He stopped, tore the sheet, folded it, and set it aside. Another sheet. He remembered Ruth's words, not for anyone to see, just to know something is still burning in the house. He lowered his wrist to steady his pulse. Then he wrote, slow, even, with enough ink. not to claim anything back, only so you'll remember how you were once loved. He placed a period. The ink was still wet. He set the paper on the windowsill to dry. A draft stirred the edge. The words were loved, cast a faint shadow on the wood. He turned back to the box, straightened the scarf, snugged the album up to the side, added a layer of tissue at the bottom. When the ink had dried, he slipped the note between the edge of the album and the scarf, where a hand opening the box would touch first. He slid the lid shut and heard wood meet wood, sealed, but not tight, so air could travel in and out like a breath. Under the kitchen light, the box's tone looked a shade warmer, as if someone had been sitting close by a little longer than usual. He lifted the box and set it for the moment at the edge of the table where the old scratch was. The scratch lay directly under the bottom, so it looked like a sunken frame no one had drawn but was there. Outside, night deepened one notch. The porch light flickered, then stilled. Arthur put on his coat and tested the box with both hands, the weight just enough that his wrists knew there was something worth carrying, but not asking the carrier to stoop. He set it down again, only to be sure the lid wouldn't slide, then pulled out a brown paper bag, slipped the box inside, folded the top, and sealed it with a strip of tape. No recipient's name, no sender's signature. Before turning the lights off, he looked around. The opposite chair still pulled askew, the blue coffee thermos beside the empty place, the tablecloth flat, the smell of wood polish lingering in the air. He flipped the switch, leaving a single small light on the porch. In the dark, the wooden box lay there, not a gift to redeem guilt or demand fairness, but a little warming box for Margaret's memory, warm just enough that, when Jack touched it, he would remember how he had once been kept warm. Late in the day, the city lit up. The windows across the way came on one by one like squares on a chessboard, each a voice of its own, none able to hear the others. In front of Jack's house, the concrete steps still held the streak of this morning's rain. The doormat stamped "Welcome" was faded at the lastie. The porch light flickered a tired beat and then held steady. Arthur carried the wooden box in his hands and walked slowly up the 3 steps. His wool overcoat held the faint smell of wood polish, and a little cemetery mud now dried. He set the box neatly by the doorframe, its edge parallel to the edge of the mat, the habit of someone who doesn't want anything out of place. He paused a second, reached to straighten a small crease at the mouth of the brown paper bag, then stood up straight. He didn't knock. He didn't ring. His hand only touched the box's edge lightly, as if passing to it a bit of the warmth still left in him, and then drew back. Inside the house came the sound of a spoon striking the rim of a bowl, the sound of running water. A child's voice, broken up. Megan saying something about a paper crown she still hadn't found. A woman's voice answered, gentle, busy. Arthur stepped down 1 step. His shadow stretched long across the porch, cutting the yellow light like a ruled line. He turned and went down. Just then, the living room curtains stirred. Jack stood behind the thin fabric, holding the hem. He hadn't meant to pull it, but his fingers tightened a notch, opening it just enough to see out. Before him, his father's charcoal coat blended into the dark of the street. The wooden box lay quiet on the step, like an animal that breathes very softly. His father's shadow paused by the gate, head tilted slightly toward the porch as if looking back. Then he walked on, the figure slow, silent. Jack didn't call out. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth like a piece of ice, not yet thawed. He let the curtain fall. In the kitchen, Megan ran past, bare feet leaving small prints on the wood floor, hugging the crown she had just found. From the sink, his wife called, "Did you see a delivery box?" Jack mumbled and let it pass. His heart thudded heavy in his wrist, the very spot where his watch always slipped when he washed dishes. He went to the door and opened it. Cold air swept onto the steps, lifting the mat a little. The wooden box had almost no scent, only warmth and a faint thread of polish. He laid his hand on the lid, this hand used to the plastic of children's toys, and the cold metal of a grill, suddenly careful, as if touching the neck of a bird. He lifted the box, tested its weight. It fit his hand. Then he set it back in the exact place, stood looking. Didn't open it. All evening, the box was there. Each time he passed the door, Jack glanced at it. His daughter stuck a star sticker on the corner of the paper bag and then forgot it. His wife told him to bring the box in to keep it from the damp. Jack said leave it there, he'd bring it in later. He put on low music and set the table. The clink of plates, the scrape of chairs, children's laughter sounds that pushed his thoughts down to the inner edge of the house where no one could see. By the time the bedroom lights dimmed, Megan had curled under the comforter, the crown abandoned on the nightstand. His wife yawned and told him to lock up. The house drew in its breath, shedding a layer of noise. On the steps, the wooden box stayed where it had first been set, receiving the night's dew with the patience of something that has waited for years. Jack turned the lock and carried the box inside. He set it on the dining table, right beside the tablecloth with the streak of blue ink his daughter had drawn that afternoon. He didn't switch on the ceiling light, only the low, yellow kitchen light. The glow warmed the box's surface, revealing grain that ran crooked like small rivers. He sat. His fingertips traced the sliding lid's edge and stopped at a tiny chip. The nick his father must have smoothed that afternoon because that edge was cleaner of dust than the rest. He slid the lid. Wood met wood with a soft rasp, the top opening like a breath let out. Inside was a brown wool scarf cradling a leather-bound album and a glazed mug with the team logo. The scarf was still soft, its fibers holding the faint scent of her old shampoo, a smell that warmed the nape of his neck like someone had set a hot towel there. He lifted the mug, his finger finding the chipped spot by instinct, the place he used to touch to his lip for luck. The kitchen light washed over the blue glaze, glittering like a night field beaded with dew. He drew the album out, and a thin sheet brushed his fingertip. The paper was folded once. He opened it. Blue, round, even script, so even the writer must have steadied their hand a long time before putting pen to paper. Not to claim anything back, only so you'll remember how you were once loved. The words stood still, not urging. The ink had dried, but were loved, looked as if still wet where his eyes fell. Jack set the paper on the table, touched its edge lightly, then opened the album. Pictures turned at an angle. Jack at 6, gap-toothed, holding up a small fish. Jack at 10, asleep in the back seat, hugging something round. Only now did he realize it was the blue coffee thermos. Jack at 12, scarf around his neck on the porch, the snowlight in his eyes. He didn't flip fast. Each photo was a short stretch of road walked back, his steps slow as if afraid to crack thin ice. In the middle pages, a pressed leaf darkened with age and a short piece of black paracord, the end still knotted the knot he had practiced all one afternoon while his mother laughed and his father kept patient. He lifted the cord and felt a fine dust of years cling to his fingertip. The refrigerator hummed softly, then went quiet. In the next room, his wife turned over. The bed gave a small creak. Jack closed the album and pressed his palm to the leather. The leather was warm, or his hand was warm. He couldn't tell. He picked up the note again and read it. For a very brief moment, he felt as if he had stepped out onto the old porch, where a straight-backed man sat with hands on his knees under a porch light that flickered once and then held still. The feeling didn't ask him to say anything. It only told him to breathe deeper. Jack folded the note and tucked it into the very first page. He set the mug on top, turning the chipped spot toward himself like a small marker. He spread the scarf a little, then folded it back so the edge brushed the back of his hand. The wool's warmth moved from skin into blood. Night had fully fallen. Outside, the city went on like a well-practiced machine. In the kitchen of a small family, a wooden box lay open on the table, making no sound, only trading heat with the air around it. Jack turned off the kitchen light, carried the box into the living room, and set it on a high shelf where few could reach. He stood there a long while, listening to his heartbeat settle. As he turned away, the porch light outside the window flickered once more. He looked and nodded very slightly, a small appointment with himself for another morning. Then he drew the curtain, leaving the box with the house's warm darkness, like a quiet proofing oven for a memory just brought home that asked for no reply. A few weeks passed. The city had eased off the cold, but afternoon still carried a lingering chill that made people pull their collars in by habit. On Arthur's porch, the yellow bulb held steady, no longer flickering with fatigue as before. He had wiped the dust from the shade, so the light was rounder and gentler. The wooden steps were dry, the grain showing like thick threads stitching the long day shut. A very soft knock, neither hesitant nor hurried. When he opened the door, the yard's cold slipped in, carrying the smell of distant exhaust and the long-worn scent of a coat. Jack stood there, shadows under his eyes from lack of sleep, hair slightly mussed as if he'd just taken off a cap. He kept both hands in his pockets, then pulled them out, then put them back in again, the motion of someone not yet decided whether to speak first or be silent first. I need to borrow money. Urgently. His voice caught in his throat and broke very small. Arthur stepped aside and let him in. The door closed behind them, the latch rubbing metal with a level sound. In the kitchen, the tablecloth lay smooth, the blue coffee thermos stood in its old place, warmth still lingering because he'd just topped it with boiling water. The opposite chair pulled askew, long ago angled, just enough that someone could sit without asking. Jack sat. He set his baseball cap on the table's edge near last year's ceramic pot scratch, and his eyes glanced around as if touching each object with a look. The wedding frame on the wall, the darkened tip wooden spoon, the gap on the shelf where the camping album had stood before it moved to his house. Those tiny absences, gathered together, gave off a low echo you hear when you arrive later than you meant to. Arthur didn't ask. He poured coffee from the blue thermos into two white porcelain cups. The deep brown stream came out quietly, the smell like the breath of someone returning to stand in the doorway, warm, thin, unjostling. He slid a cup towards Jack, his hand pausing on the cup's back for half a beat, a gesture both to anchor and to release. Jack looked as if he'd speak at once, but the sip spoke first. He held the cup with both hands, lips near the porcelain rim without drinking. Fine cracks showed on his fingertips from the weather. A thread of black paint clung at a nail bed, perhaps from fixing something at home. He set the cup down, then lifted it again, the sound of china touching the table as thin as a needle. "The money, I'll pay it back," he added. The words snapped short like a chopstick already split. Arthur nodded very slightly, not agreeing, not refusing, only confirming that a sound had just crossed the room. Jack took a thin envelope from his jacket pocket, the edge worn, inside, the faint outline of quarter-folded papers. He didn't open it. The envelope lay on the table by the scratch, where the kitchen light cast a yellow bar. Some things, when set in their proper place, make a sound even if untouched. The envelope silent, but tightening his jaw. The coffee cup silent, but letting its heat ease Arthur's wrist. He began to tell it, out of order, like pulling string from a tangled skein. An unexpected bill, an installment schedule, delayed work, a coworker who'd just quit, a car that broke down. Each piece landed on the table with a different timbre, but they met at the same point. Urgent. The word urgent shortened his breath, made his eyes skim toward the porch door, as if to say that if he stood now, he might outrun the awkwardness. Arthur sat still. His hands rested on his knees, index finger tapping a meter not quite clear. He didn't ask how much, didn't ask why, didn't ask since when. He knew those questions were like drilling more holes into a boat trying to float. He only lifted the blue thermos and topped up Jack's cup when the steam had thinned. The liquid darkened. The vapor rose hard for a moment, then softened. Beneath the broken sentences, another layer stood. A thing people call an apology, but without enough letters left to make a sentence. It was in the way Jack avoided his eyes and kept looking at the cup's rim, in the way he turned the cap without thinking, the edge of fabric rasping the table, in the way he ran 2 fingers down the envelope's length, as if smoothing a crease that wasn't in the paper. Each gesture was a letter, together spelling a word that didn't leave the tongue. The wind on the porch shifted, the shade trembled slightly. From the house across the way, the metal wind chime pinged one note and stopped. The damp smell slipped through the door crack and mixed with coffee. Arthur suddenly remembered Ruth's phrase, easier to breathe. He laid his palm on the tabletop, right over the scratch, like setting a thin bandage back on the old place. Jack faltered mid-sentence. He swallowed dry. I know that. He stopped and corrected. I'm late. The last two words were neither confession nor defense. They stood there, bare like a thumbtack pinned dead center in a photograph. Arthur nodded once more, enough to give the words a place to rest. He turned the cup's handle slightly toward Jack, like turning a chair so the one standing can sit. The kitchen silence thickened, but not heavily. It felt like a wet feather. It had weight, but was still soft. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked a minute. Jack reached for the cup and finally drank. The heat slowed his lips, his eyes softened half a degree. When he set the cup down, he drew a deeper breath. His back leaned a little into the chair. The urgent in the story stepped back half a pace. Arthur rose slowly and went to the wooden cabinet where he kept the expense ledger and a small box. He didn't open the box. He only set his hand on the lid and felt the wood warm under his skin. Behind him, Jack sat straight, both hands laced, the envelope still there. At this degree of quiet, a question could cut very deep. A nod could change the course of the whole evening. He left his hand on the lid for one more beat. Then he came back to the table and drew his chair a little closer. The blue thermos stood between them, giving off steam like a small heater set on wood. He set his hand on it, not to hold, only to remember the warmth was here, and looked straight into his son's eyes. No blame, no lesson. That gaze laid a steady ground for what might be said or might not need saying. Jack lowered his eyes, then lifted them again, as if he had just set a heavy object down on the floor. The kitchen heard both their breaths at once. The apology stayed in its original shape, unsaid but entire, and the evening tipped gently toward a decision neither was in a hurry to name. Silence in the kitchen stood still, like a lake, just after the wind has died. Steam from the two porcelain cups thinned upward, their borders of smoke losing themselves in the yellow light and dissolving. Arthur set his palm on the tabletop, right where the scratch was, as if placing a finger on the heartbeat of a house. Then, instead of answering, the story of money just poured out. He looked up and asked, slow and clear, his voice neither pushing nor forcing, "What day is your mother's birthday?" Jack stalled, as if he had just stepped on a stair one notch lower than he expected. His lips moved. His eyes shifted over inanimate things, the porcelain cup handle, the edge of the tablecloth, the corner of the wedding frame on the wall, searching for a cue hanging somewhere. August 12th, he said, leaving the sentence to hang in midair like an empty hook. Arthur neither nodded nor shook his head. He only looked toward the kitchen window, where a tiny tack mark was still visible on the wooden frame, the spot where Margaret used to clip a little reminder note year after year. The anchor of memory lay bare now, glinting like a silver speck. He turned back and asked again, in the same voice as someone setting a light object on the table, "Her favorite flower?" Jack swallowed. "Roses, red roses." The answer was quick, neat, the kind of line people use when they want to avoid starting a memory. But at the edge of his voice, there was a thin ripple, like a hairline crack in porcelain you can't see. A different color rose in Arthur's mind, the yellow daffodil stalks from the bulbs Ruth had given him, pushing up along the back fence each early March. The lilac sprays Margaret liked to set in the heavy ceramic vase, the one that left the scratch across the dining table, the faint dusting of pollen on her wrists when she'd screw in the porch bulb before a cold snap. None of those needed to be spoken. They were all standing here on the table, in the air, at the hem of his coat like witnesses, without voices. Jack bowed his head, not from shame, but because he had just touched a void, precise to the point of cruelty, a door of an old room cracked open, with nothing left inside. He laced his hands, his thumb rubbing the knuckle of his index finger as if to wake something long asleep. "I remember the flowers bloomed right at early spring," he said softly, the words shedding bits as they passed his throat. "But—" He didn't finish. Arthur turned the coffee cup handle toward Jack, a gesture like adjusting a chair so the one standing can sit. He added nothing. A corrective sentence now would only stiffen the emptiness in the other's chest. He left it so the second question could ring out its own overtones, not to force Jack to remember, but to let him hear the not remembering inside himself. The second hand on the wall clock passed a mark with a dry tick, sharper than usual. On the porch, the metal wind chime shook a solitary note. Jack looked that way, then back at the table. The yellow light deepened the tabletop scratch by half a tone, like an old bruise showing under skin when the weather turns cold. I thought I knew, he said to himself, not to anyone. His hand found the baseball cap, turned the brim, then stopped. He opened the envelope beside him, took out a few quarter-folded sheets, and flipped them without reading, as if the numbers on the paper would line up by themselves if they were given more light. Arthur reached for the blue coffee thermos and poured more into Jack's cup. The deep brown stream fell quietly, not a drop splashing. The fresh heat fogged the window glass for a second, sketching a thin cloud. He drew his hand back and set it on the lid of the wooden box on the shelf, the one where he kept his savings, then took it away again, as if testing the strength of the silence. There was no rebuke, no argument about duty, only two questions placed into the exact void, and the void answered by having no answer. Jack's shoulders dropped half a centimeter. He slid back a little in the chair, as if making room for what had just appeared. In his eyes was a kind of fatigue not born of lack of sleep, but of finally looking straight at a thing that had been standing in the house for a long time. I remember the wool scarf, he said at last, suddenly, his voice thickening. In winter, she used to wrap it on me. Smelled like soap. He laughed faintly, unable to hide the tremor at his eye's edge. I figured red roses, because that's what most of the pictures in people's houses show. But Mom, he let it trail off. In his mind, a pale lilac patch and a yellow streak of daffodil passed by like wind flipping a calendar page. Arthur nodded lightly, as if receiving a recollection that had just found its way home. He pushed the coffee cup a little closer to Jack. The money story was still there, the envelope still open, the numbers still waiting. But among the numbers, another small dot had lit, not a correct answer, but the feeling of absence newly recognized by its name. And when a lack has a name, people suddenly know where to set a hand. Wind moved once across the porch. The shade trembled very slightly and settled. Arthur leaned back, his eyes steady on his son's face. From the kitchen's corner, the dark-tipped wooden spoon sat like a low accent. Here, in this room, justice wasn't an indictment. It was like a clean mirror set before you, not forcing anyone to look. But if you do, you see both the part missing and the part that remains. Jack folded the envelope and set it aside. He wrapped both hands around the cup and breathed deeply, letting the heat touch his sternum. In that brief moment, he understood that he had lost, not only his mother, but also the paths that led back to her. And because of that, there were things he would have to walk again from the start, not to repay anyone, but to rebuild the bridge that had rotted. Arthur didn't say right or wrong. He only held the silence the way one holds a door open. Behind that silence, a decision began to take shape, unshowy, undramatic-like, when a person stands under the porch and decides to replace a light bulb in the morning. Hazy morning. Mist lay a thin layer over the street as if someone had just blown flour across a tabletop. Arthur sat in the pickup, engine off, arms around the blue coffee thermos. Warmth from the lid breathed onto the glass, pooling into a round, fogged halo. Through that blur, he could see Jack's porch. Jack stood on a low folding chair, shoulders hunched against the cold. His coat was half open, sleeves pulled past his wrists so they wouldn't catch. The old bulb had already been loosened. He held it between two fingers and turned it slowly, head tipped back so his neck stretched, fine tendons rising under the skin. The chair wobbled a little. He stopped, set his feet a notch wider, and tried again. The movements were clumsy but patient. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a new bulb wrapped in paper. The glossy sheet made a small rustle like dry leaves. He peeled it carefully, leaving a thin ring of paper around the base so it wouldn't slip. Lifting the bulb, he set it to the threads and turned clockwise, pausing half a beat at each half turn like a man checking his own breathing. On the final turn, his hand hesitated, then tightened decisively. In the truck, Arthur set the thermos on the seat, his hand still holding warmth. He flipped the switch. The porch bulb burst to a white dot, then drifted to yellow, round, steady. The light touched the lip of the concrete step, spread across the welcome mat with its faded last E, climbed the door frame, and rested a moment on Jack's cheek. He squinted, pressed the switch off, then on again. The light held steady, did not flicker. Easier to breathe. A sentence skimmed through his mind, Ruth's voice thin as the steam off warm bread. Jack didn't go in at once. He stood on the chair for a second, looking at the new bulb as if at a strange thing already familiar. Then he stepped down, folded the chair, and set it against the wall. With his right hand, he rubbed the shade's rim, wiping the fine dust in slow circles, the way one comforts a thing that doesn't know how to cry out. As he pulled the door, he caught on the sound of the hinge gently breathing. No squeal. He tried it open and closed twice, listening to the soft silk on silk of it. A flicker of a smile, only at the eye corners, then gone. Arthur leaned and cracked the window a finger's width. Morning air crept in, carrying the damp of concrete and a stray hint of butter sugar from somewhere in the house. Jack bent to pick up a silver ribbon snagged on the step since the party, rolled it into a small pellet and slipped it into his pocket, smoothed the doormat, squared its edge parallel to the step, a kind of straightening Arthur recognized at once, his own habit, taking the long way round through his son's hands. He stepped back a pace, taking it in, the porch light warm and round, laying a gold halo across half the door. A faint wind rang the little wind chime once. Jack touched the shade again with a fingertip, as if sealing it. Then he pulled out his phone, opened the camera, raised it, lowered it. Didn't take a picture. He pocketed the phone, opened the door to go in, and before he disappeared, glanced back at the light for one more beat. In the truck, Arthur leaned back, his hand unconsciously settling on the thermos lid. The warmth traveled into his palm, then into his chest. He didn't call. He didn't knock. He only looked through the windshield, where the brand new yellow was wrapping the step like a blanket just out of the dryer. On the porch across the street, a neighbor was hanging towels. At the far end of the block, the milk truck idled by, leaving a faint gasoline smell. The city woke on sounds that needed no prompting. And on Jack's porch, a light was on right in the season Margaret used to change it. He lifted the thermos lid, poured a mouthful into it, blew lightly, drank. The thin, scummy bitterness of cooled coffee slid down his throat and left a ribbon of warmth behind. He set the lid back, turned the key, the engine murmured. Before pulling away, he paused half a beat and let his eyes go back to the porch. The light held, softening the edge of morning. No words were spoken, none were needed. The act had been set into the exact space of what used to be missing, like a thread catching again after many seasons misaligned. And in the yellow of a very ordinary morning, atonement stood there, quiet but warm. Evening drew down slowly, like a heavy curtain. Arthur came back to the kitchen and set his keys on the edge of the neatly folded tablecloth. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't switch on the TV. He only set the kettle, poured a little boiling water into the blue coffee thermos, and twisted the lid until the familiar small tack. His hand stayed on the lid for a long beat, as if keeping the warmth from slipping away too quickly. Through the window, the porch across the street was lit. The new bulb Jack had replaced that morning cast a very round halo of gold, steady, not trembling, spilling onto the concrete steps, touching the edge of the faded welcome mat, then climbing the door frame like a strand of wool wrapped around a neck late at night. It had been a long time since the light on that porch stood so still. He didn't go out to call. He didn't hurry to write a text. He pulled out a chair, sat in his usual spot, and placed his palm on the blue thermos as if laying a hand on a close relative's shoulder. The warmth passed through the chipped paint of the metal into his palm, slid quietly up to his wrist, then gentled in his chest. On the table, last year's scratch from the heavy ceramic pot still lay in the center, half a tone darker in the kitchen light. He didn't hide it. The scratch now looked like the navel of the room, a place where everything gathers silently. Out on the street, the lamps came on one by one. The windows of the houses lit up in turn like squares on a chessboard. The metal wind chime across the way gave a soft clink, just one note, and fell quiet. On Jack's porch, the thin curtain trembled as if someone had just passed by. No faces showed, only the calm shadow of a home with people living in it. A small figure darted past, surely Megan. On the wall, the shadow of an adult hand reached up to straighten a picture hanging askew. No sound carried across, but the porch's yellow was enough to tell the story. Ruth walked by from the far end of the street, a cloth basket in her arms. She paused at the gate, looked up at the new halo of light for a second, then gave the smallest nod, the kind reserved for a flame just kindled. Her shadow slid past Arthur's window, leaving in the room a thin thought, easier to breathe. He topped up the blue thermos, not because he was thirsty, but to keep the steam in place. Then he stood and went to his own porch door. The shade had been wiped clean of dust. The yellow light held the wooden door, laying a thin line of brightness along the bridge of his nose as he leaned on the post. On the sidewalk, the oak's last leaf spun and lay still, no longer trying to cling to the branch. From the gate, the street looked back like a pale gold river flowing past each step. The light from Jack's house reached the edge of Arthur's yard, just enough to turn a dark strip of grass into a small rug one could step onto without hesitation. He smiled, only at the eyes. He didn't reward himself with a "there you go," didn't drag the past out to tally it. He let the light speak for itself, low, small, but steady, late at night. The city's noise drained away like water from a basin. Far off, a milk truck passed, leaving a faint ribbon of gasoline and disappearing. Inside, the clock kept time, the second hand tapping even as the breath of someone sleeping well. He closed the door and put the blue thermos back in its exact place at the center of the table. The warmth was still there. Before switching off the kitchen light, he looked out the window once more. The halo on Jack's porch held, whole, like a gold coin set in the night. He touched the edge of the scratch with a fingertip, a light tap, like knocking on a closed room. No one answered, and none was needed. Tonight's presence was enough for the unspoken question to have its answer. As the house sank into a gentle dark, the yellow across the way still stood. No one knew what would be said tomorrow, what would be done, which crease of memory they would brush up against. But tonight, the street looked a little warmer, a porch light holding steady, a hinge that didn't cry, a mat smoothed flat, and a blue thermos on the shelf newly filled. That much was enough for a promise to take shape, unshowy, unhurried of a slow but certain mending, traveling the way small, steady warmth does, from one hand to another. In the end, no one won. What remained was a porch standing lit late into the night, a wooden box lying still on the shelf, and the blue coffee thermos back where it belonged. Arthur didn't demand, didn't justify. He set warmth within Jack's reach and then stepped back into just enough darkness so that the rest, Jack himself, would have to step toward. Revenge here isn't a hard, steely turning away, nor an indictment. It's the right to refuse to buy closeness. It's giving silence back to silence, letting justice do its work through small things. A light bulb screwed tight, a hinge that no longer squeals, a cup of coffee poured without an order attached. When the porch's yellow light holds steady, you know something has returned to its place, not loud, but lasting. That night, the street was a little warmer. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but if a thread had been threaded, it would stitch slowly and surely from the father's hand to the son's. If this story touches you, in your own life, what is the light bulb you once tightened? Leave just one small detail. Who knows, it might help someone breathe a little easier.